The first contact did not arrive with ceremony or announcement. It appeared simply as figures emerging through haze and movement, shapes in unfamiliar helmets and coats resolving into men who were neither enemy nor faceless abstraction. American soldiers, still adjusting to the rhythm of a foreign shoreline, saw them first as silhouettes moving with a different cadence, not hurried, not aggressive, but purposeful in a way that suggested long familiarity with this kind of ground. The beach, moments earlier a field of inward focus and private calculation, became quietly shared. No one raised a voice. No signal was needed. The recognition passed through glances, small shifts in posture, the easing of fingers around rifle stocks as the pattern of those approaching made itself understood. British troops advanced with the contained economy of men who had already crossed similar terrain too many times to waste motion. Their equipment sat differently on their bodies, worn into place rather than newly fitted, and even from a distance that difference registered. To the Americans, many of whom were encountering their first sustained ground contact of the campaign, this presence carried a subtle weight. It was not reassurance exactly, and it was not surprise. It was something quieter, the realization that others had been here before, not just in theory or planning rooms, but in the same damp air and unstable footing. When the two lines came close enough for faces to be distinguished, the moment stretched rather than broke. Mud and salt marked everyone equally. There were no formal greetings, no immediate exchange of words, just the brief, careful study that occurs when men measure one another without intending to. A few British soldiers gave short nods, barely perceptible, not as salutes but as acknowledgments that required no reply. Some Americans returned them. Others simply watched, absorbing the detail of accents they had not yet heard, insignia they had only seen on paper, expressions that held neither welcome nor distance, only a controlled awareness of shared circumstance. In that narrow interval, the broader scale of the operation receded. What remained was a small, human geometry of men standing in proximity, each group carrying its own assumptions and histories. For the Americans, the British presence introduced a layer of continuity, a sense that this beach was not a beginning but part of something already in motion. The British, for their part, observed the Americans with the reserved curiosity of veterans encountering a new unit, aware that numbers and energy would soon matter, but not yet ready to draw conclusions. A few words did pass, spoken low and without ceremony. Simple confirmations, fragments of information about where the lines were forming, where resistance had been heavier or lighter. Voices stayed level, neither hurried nor expansive. The Americans noticed the steadiness in the British tone, the way sentences were delivered as if they were already part of a routine that had been rehearsed in less forgiving places. It was not confidence in the loud sense. It was a practiced containment, an assumption that whatever was unfolding would be met in the same measured way. For a moment, the Americans felt themselves seen not as individuals but as an element newly inserted into a larger, older pattern. There was a faint awareness of being evaluated, not critically, but carefully, as one might look at a tool just taken from its case. The British were not impressed, and they were not dismissive. They simply took note. That, in itself, carried an unspoken gravity. Around them, the beach continued its subdued activity, but between the two groups the atmosphere remained almost still. No one stepped forward to bridge the space. It closed on its own as practical needs drew them closer, as directions were exchanged and paths overlapped. the sense of separation faded without being acknowledged. What had been two forces became, in that unremarkable way that war often prefers, a single, loosely aligned presence. The Americans, absorbing this quiet transition, felt a shift in their own internal posture. The operation was no longer something they were entering alone. The British, already embedded in the wider architecture of the invasion, were now part of their immediate environment. There was no spoken reflection on what this meant, but it registered all the same. In the shared glances and brief exchanges, a muted understanding settled. Whatever unfolded from here would not belong to one flag or the other, but to the narrow strip of ground on which they were standing, and to the restrained, unspoken cooperation that had just begun to take shape. The first words exchanged did not carry volume, only a careful weight, as though both sides understood that anything spoken would linger longer than intended. An American voice, low and edged with fatigue, broke the quiet by stating what had already been seen, identifying the men across from him as British, not with certainty but with a kind of testing tone, as if the syllables themselves were being held up for verification. A British reply came back without hesitation, clipped and even, confirming the identity without embellishment, and in that brief transaction a small layer of uncertainty dissolved. There was no greeting beyond that, no introduction, only the acknowledgement that two separate movements had intersected and were now aware of one another. Another American, younger in sound but not careless, offered a short remark about not expecting to see them so soon. The words were not framed as complaint or relief, simply an observation spoken aloud, as though the speaker needed to hear it to make it real. A British soldier answered with a restrained half-sentence that suggested the same surprise, but without the inflection of novelty. His tone carried the faint implication that time and distance rarely behaved as planned in operations like this, and that the appearance of Allied faces, however welcome, was still something to be processed rather than celebrated. There were pauses between these exchanges that felt deliberate. Men listened not only to what was said but to how it was said, measuring accents, pacing, and the absence of unnecessary detail. One American asked, almost quietly, where the nearest British line had settled. The question was practical, but beneath it lay a deeper curiosity about how firmly the situation was held. The answer came in short, geographic terms, naming positions without dramatic emphasis, which conveyed more confidence than any reassurance could have done. A brief comment about the conditions followed, something about the ground being worse than expected. It was met with a dry, understated agreement from the British side, delivered in a way that implied this was not new information but a familiar inconvenience. The exchange carried a muted humor, not enough to soften the moment, but enough to acknowledge that both groups were now sharing the same physical discomfort and the same constrained expectations. Some Americans spoke less, choosing instead to listen as the British voices moved through a series of small, factual remarks about routes, obstacles, and the slow alignment of units. Each statement was offered without flourish, and that restraint itself became a form of communication. It told the Americans that these men were not improvising, even if the situation required adjustment. The language was controlled, as if every word had already been weighed against the possibility of being wrong. One American finally admitted, in a tone that was neither embarrassed nor bold, that this was his first time seeing British troops outside of training references and photographs. The remark hung in the air for a moment before a British soldier responded with a simple acknowledgement, neither amused nor dismissive, just a quiet acceptance that such first encounters were inevitable in a war assembled from many separate paths. There was no attempt to make the moment lighter. It remained what it was, a recognition of difference inside a shared task. As the conversation continued in fragments, surprise gave way to a more subdued recognition. Voices settled into a rhythm that matched the environment, low and steady, as though both sides were unconsciously aligning themselves not only tactically but psychologically. Uncertainty did not disappear, but it was named and contained through these brief verbal contacts. Each question and answer tightened the invisible thread between them, turning two distinct forces into something more coordinated, if not yet entirely comfortable. By the time the talking slowed, what remained was not a sense of resolution but a quieter, more grounded awareness of mutual presence. The words exchanged had not been dramatic, but they had been enough to replace the unknown with something measurable. In that controlled, unspoken way, the first reactions had done their work, leaving behind a shared understanding that whatever followed would unfold in the narrow space between what had been expected and what was now unmistakably real. What the men said next carried a subtle dissonance, as though the words were trying to reconcile two different versions of the same moment. Several Americans spoke in short, almost tentative phrases about how they had imagined this meeting would look, their voices revealing that what stood in front of them did not quite match the pictures they had carried across the Atlantic. One remarked, without irony, that he had expected something more formal, perhaps lines and signals, something that felt closer to the order of a drill ground. The British response to this was not corrective but quietly amused, a brief comment noting that very little on a real landing ever resembled the diagrams that came before it. Another American mentioned how strange it was to find Allied troops already moving with such familiarity across ground that still felt unstable under his own boots. The observation was not voiced as admiration, only as a careful comparison between what he had prepared himself to encounter and what was actually unfolding. A British soldier answered by acknowledging that the terrain had a way of erasing expectations quickly, that even men who had crossed similar beaches before rarely found them the same twice. His tone suggested not wisdom but routine, as though disappointment and adjustment had become ordinary companions. There were remarks about timing as well, about how some had assumed the meeting would happen later, after positions were more clearly defined and the noise had thinned. Instead, they were standing face to face amid an environment that still felt unsettled. The Americans spoke of this in low voices, not complaining but noting the dislocation between their mental schedule and the compressed reality of the operation. The British replies carried a faint recognition of that same dislocation, though expressed with a steadier cadence, as if they had already learned not to trust clocks in places like this. One American, older and more deliberate in his speech, admitted that he had expected the British to look different, though he did not specify how. The remark hovered in a space between curiosity and mild embarrassment. A British soldier responded with a dry comment about uniforms and faces rarely surviving long under the same weather and strain, quietly implying that whatever had been imagined would have been stripped away by now. The exchange held no tension, only the soft unraveling of preconceptions that had not yet been tested until this moment. Even the way the men spoke betrayed the contrast they were registering. American voices, though controlled, carried the faint edge of something newly encountered, a careful recalibration happening with each sentence. British voices, by comparison, sounded less surprised by the mismatch between plan and fact, as if that gap had long since become an expected part of their vocabulary. This difference did not create distance, but it did shape the rhythm of the conversation, with one side quietly absorbing while the other offered understated acknowledgement. Comments about equipment and positioning followed, and here too expectations were gently adjusted. An American noted that he had assumed certain sectors would be clearer by now. The British reply came back in practical terms, indicating that what looked clear on paper often hid complications that only revealed themselves on the ground. There was no attempt to dramatize this, just a matter-of-fact alignment of perception with reality, spoken in a tone that suggested this kind of recalibration was as routine as checking a map. Through these exchanges, a shared understanding began to take form, not because anyone stated it directly, but because the contrast itself was being quietly recognized on both sides. What they had thought this meeting would be, and what it actually was, did not need to be debated. It was enough that it could be named in fragments of conversation, in small, unguarded remarks that allowed expectation to give way to something more solid. The men did not sound disappointed, only adjusted, as if the act of speaking had helped them move from what they had imagined into what they were now required to navigate. At first the words moved cautiously, almost guarded, as though both groups were still speaking from positions formed before they had truly taken one another in. Early remarks were brief and functional, shaped by habit more than by observation, but as faces and postures became familiar, the tone began to adjust. American soldiers, who had initially spoken in the flat language of procedure, started to let small notes of appraisal enter their voices. They commented quietly on the way the British held themselves, on how their movements seemed less hurried and more contained, and these observations were offered not as praise but as attempts to situate what they were seeing within their own internal expectations. British replies, which at first had been clipped and narrowly practical, began to widen slightly as well. A few men allowed themselves short, dry acknowledgments of the Americans' numbers and energy, delivered in a manner that suggested both awareness and restraint. There was no effusion, only a recognition that this newly arrived force carried a different tempo. The exchange remained controlled, yet something subtle had shifted. The words were no longer just about terrain or position. They had started to reflect a mutual reading of character. As this assessment continued, Americans grew a touch more direct. One voice noted that the British seemed to move as if the chaos around them had already been absorbed into routine. Another observed, almost to himself, that there was a steadiness there that did not need to be announced. These were not compliments spoken aloud for effect, but quiet evaluations released in low tones as though the speakers were thinking through what they meant even as they said it. The British heard them, and their responses carried a faint, almost imperceptible shift in posture, a slight easing that suggested the recognition was neither unwelcome nor surprising. British comments, too, began to reflect their own reassessment. A soldier remarked that the Americans appeared more numerous than he had expected, the statement delivered without exaggeration, simply marking a reality that was now visible. Another mentioned their equipment, noting how new much of it looked, not with envy or skepticism but with the practical curiosity of men who understood that freshness brought both advantages and uncertainties. These observations were offered in the same low, even voices that had characterized the first exchanges, but the content had changed. It was no longer abstract. It was grounded in what stood directly in front of them. In this way, the dialogue evolved from simple acknowledgement into something more nuanced. Each side was no longer speaking only from preconception, but from a growing, immediate awareness of the other. Americans adjusted their tone as they realized they were not meeting a distant ally but a group of men already shaped by prolonged exposure to this kind of pressure. British soldiers, in turn, recognized in the Americans a mixture of readiness and untested weight, a combination that could not be captured by reports alone. Their words reflected this, becoming slightly more descriptive, slightly more attuned. The pauses between sentences lengthened as well, as though both groups were allowing what they heard to settle before replying. Silence became part of the exchange, giving space for the ongoing, unspoken evaluation. When someone did speak, it was often to add a small detail that had just been noticed, a way of refining the picture that was taking shape. A comment about how the Americans carried themselves when they waited, or how the British scanned the surroundings even while talking, slipped into the conversation, further deepening the mutual appraisal. By the time these quiet exchanges slowed, what remained was a sense that the initial, surface-level reactions had been replaced by something more measured. The words had shifted from cautious formality to a restrained but genuine recognition of who was standing there. Neither side needed to state this directly. It was evident in the way voices now carried less uncertainty and more calibrated attention, as if both groups had quietly, methodically adjusted their understanding to match the reality unfolding in front of them. What the men said, and what they chose not to say, carried with it a set of quiet assumptions about what it meant to be allied in this place and at this moment. American voices, though measured, revealed an underlying expectation that partnership would bring a certain clarity, a sense that the presence of British troops would impose order on a landscape that still felt uncertain. In the way they asked questions and framed their remarks, there was a subtle leaning toward the idea that experience resided just across from them, that the men in different uniforms possessed a deeper familiarity with the conditions now surrounding them. This assumption was not voiced as deference, but it sat beneath the words all the same, shaping the tone in which information was requested and received. British replies reflected a different set of beliefs. Their language suggested an ingrained understanding that allies were not sources of certainty so much as additional variables in an already unstable equation. When they spoke, they did so without projecting authority, even when they clearly knew more about the immediate terrain or the recent pattern of movement. The restraint in their voices implied an assumption that everyone here was operating with partial knowledge, and that cooperation would be built not on hierarchy but on the careful exchange of what each side could offer. In this way, their remarks carried a quiet skepticism about any notion of automatic advantage simply because a partner had arrived. Within these exchanges, the Americans' underlying optimism about Allied presence became apparent. A comment about how quickly things might settle now that the British were on hand, delivered without exaggeration, hinted at a belief that shared effort would naturally lead to stability. It was not naive, but it was hopeful, reflecting a cultural inclination to see coordination as something that could be achieved through mutual recognition alone. The British response to such remarks was typically non-committal, neither endorsing nor rejecting the sentiment, as though experience had taught them that alignment did not guarantee simplicity. There was also an assumption, present on both sides, that allies would understand one another without much explanation. Americans spoke as if certain procedures and expectations were already shared, even when that was not entirely the case. British soldiers, in turn, sometimes answered in shorthand, presuming that the Americans would grasp the implications without needing them spelled out. When these assumptions failed to align perfectly, the slight pauses that followed revealed how much had been taken for granted. Yet even these moments were handled with restraint, corrected quietly rather than challenged. Underlying many of the British remarks was a tempered view of alliance itself, shaped by long exposure to coalition warfare. Their words suggested an understanding that cooperation was as much about managing differences as it was about sharing objectives. They did not expect the Americans to mirror their own habits or pace, and this acceptance was embedded in the way they spoke, allowing room for variation without drawing attention to it. The Americans, listening, began to sense this unspoken framework, even if they did not yet fully share it. For the Americans, alliance carried a more immediate emotional weight. Their remarks hinted at relief that they were no longer alone on this stretch of ground, that the abstract idea of partnership had taken on a visible human form. This belief did not lead them to relax their guard, but it did soften the edges of their speech, making their questions and comments slightly more open. The British, hearing this, did not respond with overt reassurance, but their steady presence and controlled replies acknowledged the sentiment without amplifying it. In this way, the spoken remarks became a mirror of deeper attitudes. Beneath the practical exchanges lay different but compatible views of what it meant to be allied under pressure. The Americans leaned toward the idea of shared strength as a stabilizing force, while the British carried a more cautious understanding of cooperation as something that had to be constantly adjusted and maintained. Neither perspective was declared outright, but both were present in the cadence, choice of words, and measured silences that defined their first sustained conversation. The words spoken in those first minutes did not fade as quickly as their low volume might have suggested. They remained, quietly embedded in the way both groups carried themselves afterward, shaping the invisible framework through which the rest of the day would be understood. Nothing that was said was remarkable on its own. There were no declarations, no statements of unity, no lines that would later be quoted. Yet within that restrained exchange, a set of expectations had been established about how these two forces would exist beside one another under strain. The Americans had heard, in the British voices, a steadiness that suggested continuity rather than novelty. The British had heard, in the American replies, a mixture of resolve and untested momentum. Those impressions did not vanish. They became part of the background against which every subsequent interaction would be measured. As the hours unfolded, these early words served as a kind of quiet reference point. When confusion arose, as it inevitably did, men returned not to formal orders but to the tone that had been set in those first moments. The absence of exaggeration, the deliberate economy of speech, and the shared willingness to admit uncertainty without surrendering control all had their roots in that initial contact. The Americans had learned that their allies would not oversell the situation, and the British had learned that the newcomers would listen closely when something was stated plainly. This mutual calibration, established in simple remarks on a narrow stretch of ground, carried more operational weight than any rehearsed briefing. There was also a deeper, more psychological effect. For many Americans, the first words from British mouths confirmed that they were now inside a continuum that stretched back through years of fighting they had not experienced. The tone of those voices, shaped by long exposure to pressure, made the scale of what they had entered more real than any abstract briefing could. For the British, hearing the Americans speak Hearing the particular blend of determination and unfamiliarity in their cadence reinforced the reality that this day marked a genuine expansion of the war's human landscape. These were not interchangeable units. They were distinct groups whose differences would now have to be held within a single, shared effort. The lasting significance lay not in what was decided, but in how it was decided to speak. By choosing restraint over bravado and observation over assertion, both sides set a standard for their cooperation. The words had implied that authority would not be assumed, that experience would be offered rather than imposed, and that questions could be asked without being read as weakness. This created a subtle but durable form of trust, one that did not depend on sentiment but on the consistent, controlled exchange of information. In a setting where so much was unstable, this quiet reliability became a fixed point. Over time, many of the men would forget the exact phrasing of those early remarks, but they would not forget the feeling of them. They would remember that when they first encountered their allies, the atmosphere had been neither chaotic nor ceremonious, but composed. That memory would color later judgments, making it easier to interpret unfamiliar behavior not as threat or incompetence, but as difference within a shared purpose. In this way, the initial words functioned as a kind of lens, shaping perception long after the sounds themselves had been absorbed by the larger noise of the operation. Even when tensions arose, as they inevitably did in a complex, multinational effort, the imprint of those first exchanges remained. Men who had once spoken quietly across a narrow space could later disagree without immediately doubting one another's intentions. The early demonstration of controlled communication had established a baseline of credibility. It had shown that these allies, however varied their backgrounds, approached the situation with a similar seriousness and an unwillingness to indulge in unnecessary display. Thus, the significance of those first words extended far beyond the moment in which they were uttered. They marked the point at which abstract alliance became lived reality, not through symbolism but through the simple, disciplined act of speaking to one another under pressure. In the vast, impersonal scale of D-Day, this might seem small, yet for the men involved it provided a human anchor, a reminder that even in the most complex operations, the tone set in the first quiet exchange can shape the entire texture of what follows.